there, and welcome to our next lesson in APUS history. Today we're tackling Expanding Democracy, topic 4.7. So our learning objective is to explain the causes and effects of the expansion of participatory democracy from 1800 to 1848. So for our key concepts today, we're really looking at the transition to a more participatory democracy, and particularly looking at the expansion of suffrage and the growth of political parties. So we are going to start with some historical context, address the elections of 1824 and 28, and then really emphasize those factors that increased the participatory democracy. So things to remember. We've talked about the era of good feelings in several lessons up to this point, this general spirit of nationalism and optimism, but that also there was a growth of sectionalism happening at the same time. Well, really, this time period is characteristic of Monroe's presidencies. And by the time we get to the election of 1824, the era of good feelings has ended. Part of that process in ending the era of good feelings was the Panic of 1819. And so what kind of spurred on this panic was when the Second Bank of the United States tightened credit to try to respond to the growing inflation. But what happened was the massive increase of unemployment, bankruptcies, people were imprisoned for their debt. And so what we begin to see happening is people, especially in rural areas, were calling for more participation in government because they wanted to hold the leaders accountable for the decisions they were making regarding the economy. Another important piece of this puzzle is population growth. So we see the US population growing rapidly during this time, and a third of the population is living west of the Alleghenies. And so there's several new Western states that are happening in this era that end up shifting the population west, which then shifts some of the values that those people have, or what the nation overall values. So let's dive into the election of 1824. This is one of our more unique elections in American history. It's one of the elections where the House of Representatives actually ends up having to choose the president. So we have four candidates that are all technically Democratic Republicans. So what we see happening is John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State. He was really considered to be the strongest candidate for the presidency because each of the prior presidents had been the Secretary of State prior to their presidency. Andrew Jackson was a Westerner. Many people really didn't consider that he was going to be as popular as he was. So the candidates needed to earn 131 electoral votes in order to win. And even though Jackson won the majority of the electoral votes and the popular votes, it wasn't 131. And so the decision moved to the House of Representatives. Now, because Clay came in fourth, the House of Representatives has to choose between the top three. That's part of the Constitution. And so Clay throws his support behind Adams. He really feared what Jackson would do to the country if he was elected. So when the House voted, Adams obtained 13 votes, Jackson 7, and Crawford 4. And then 5 days later, Adams named Henry Clay as Secretary of State. And so Jackson and his supporters claim that a corrupt bargain has taken place, that Clay used his influence as the Speaker of the House as former Speaker of the House, to convince Adams to choose him for this loftier position, right? Because Secretary of State has led frequently to the presidency. So if he can become the Secretary of State, maybe then he'll be president in the future. And so Jackson and his supporters claim this corrupt bargain had taken place. The will of the people had been ignored. The election had been stolen. And so Jackson begins his campaign. When he leaves Washington in 1825, he is basically beginning to campaign already for the 1828 election as the common man, as a war hero, as a self-made man, as someone who won't ignore the will of the people. So as a result of the election of 1824 and some, divergent opinions that had already been brewing, we see factions develop. These are rival groups within the Democratic Republican Party. They are not really their own political parties, but they're really factions that are within the same party. So Democrats will be led by Jackson and Calhoun. And they are going to hold most closely to ideologies that we think of with Democratic Republicans. So limited federal power, strict constructionism, states' rights. They really don't want the federal government to play a role in the economy because they fear what the federal government will do regarding slavery. And they are opposed to the American system. National Republicans, led by Adams and Clay, who will eventually become the Whig Party and do have many views that are similar to Federalists. They have these views of a expansive federal government, loose construction, funding for the American system. So even though they technically are not a separate political party, they really have kind of moved towards the farther right side of the spectrum here. So this leads up to the election of 1828, in which we have Andrew Jackson going against incumbent John Quincy Adams. And the context here is that in the years between 1824 and 1828, John Quincy Adams had spent quite a bit of money on internal improvements, asked Congress to fund many projects, and a new tariff had passed in 1828, which alienated a lot of Southerners. This one becomes called the Tariff of Abominations, and we're going to talk about that in our next lesson. The campaigns were very intense, mudslinging galore. There were smears that Adams' wife was born out of wedlock and Jackson's wife committed adultery. Some say that these accusals were so intense that it actually led to Jackson's wife's death. She had a heart attack shortly after Jackson was elected. But either way, these campaigns drew a lot of interest and ended up having a huge voter turnout. And so we can see that Jackson wins, but it is very regionally based where the voters are or who the voters are voting for. So what are the reasons? If we look, these maps are from 1800 to 1830, but even if we just consider the elections of 1828, we have over 1.1 million people voting in 1828. And in 1824, it looks like it's somewhere around the 350,000 mark. So we see at least a tripling of voters between 1824 and 1828. And what is one of the reasons for that? Well, a major reason is going to be because of our Western states coming in and now being voters by 1830, our huge population movement out there. Really importantly as well is going to be the changes in voter qualifications. So as these Western states came into office, many of them by their constitution had universal white male suffrage. So there were no more property or religious requirements for voting. And as Western states began to come into the United States with those requirements, or I should say without those requirements, Eastern states started to eliminate those requirements. And so really we see the common man, the poor, being able to vote in most places. We also see changes in the ways that candidates are nominated. Before 1830, we see that many were using just the party leaders to nominate candidates, but now there's going to be conventions which allow for common citizens to participate in that process as well, spreading democracy in another way. The election of the president had been done by state legislators choosing electors, but by 1832, all states except South Carolina had shifted that to the voters. And then, as I've mentioned before, Jackson, portraying himself as a common man, really encouraged people in the West and the poor. They believed that he was going to represent their decisions and their values. And so it encouraged them to come out and participate in the election process. So there's just some of the reasons why we see the rise in participatory democracy, also sometimes called the spread of democracy in this time period. So I'm going to end here with two quotes. One is going to be, this first one is really opposed to the idea of universal white male suffrage. And then the second is going to be in favor. So this is from James Kent. That extreme democratic principle, universal suffrage, has been regarded with terror by the wise men of every age because in every European republic, ancient and modern, in which it has been tried, it has terminated disastrously and has been productive of corruption, injustice, violence, and tyranny. The tendency of universal suffrage is to jeopardize the rights of property and the principles of liberty. There is a constant tendency in the poor to covet and to share the plunder of the rich, in the debtor to relax or avoid the obligation of contracts, in the majority to tyrannize over the minority and trample down their rights, in the indolent and the profligate to cast the whole burdens of society upon the industrious and virtuous. So, really giving multiple reasons here why universal white male suffrage should be avoided. And on the opposite side here, George Evans, the founder of the Working Man's Party, says, "We have trusted to influence of the justice and good sense of our political leaders to prevent the continuance of abuses which destroy the natural bands of equality, so essential to the attainment of moral happiness. But they have been deaf to the voice of justice. Therefore, we, the working class of society of the city of New York, do, in the spirit and by the authority of that political liberty which has been promised to us equally with our fellow man, solemnly publish and declare that we are, and of right ought to be, entitled to equal means to obtain equal moral happiness and social enjoyment, and that all lawful and constitutional measures ought to be adopted to the attainment of those objects." So really asking for those restrictions that prevent them from obtaining equality and happiness. All of those things should be removed. So I hope that this lesson was helpful for you in understanding the causes and effects of the expansion of participatory democracy. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe. Thanks.